The massive alien ship appeared in Earth's orbit without warning on a cold morning in March 2247. It hung there like a silver needle against the black canvas of space, scanning the planet below with instruments that humanity could barely understand. Captain Daniel Harris watched from the observation deck of the orbital defense station, his hands gripping the railing as the alien vessel completed its survey. He had spent 15 years in the United Defense Force, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. The ship was elegant and terrifying, its hull smooth and reflective, at least 3 times larger than anything humans had ever built. For 6 hours it remained there, passive and silent, ignoring all attempts at communication from Earth's Defense Command. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vessel simply vanished, leaving behind only a brief data transmission that would change everything. Commander Vex Znal of the Cretharian Survey Corps returned to his flagship with the survey data, uploading it into the Empire's vast database without much thought. The third planet was inhabited by a species called humans, bipedal creatures who had only recently achieved basic faster-than-light travel. They had a handful of colonies scattered across their star system, primitive settlements on Mars, and a few mining operations in the asteroid belt. Their weapons were laughably outdated, based on chemical propulsion and simple energy projection. Their ships were slow and inefficient, burning fuel like wastrels with no understanding of proper quantum mechanics. The survey report was clear and precise. Earth posed no threat to the Cretharian Empire, offered no resources worth the effort of extraction, and showed no signs of the psionic abilities that sometimes emerged in younger species. The recommendation was filed in triplicate as regulations demanded. Ignore this world until circumstances changed. That dismissal burned in the minds of every human who learned about it. Admiral Lisa Morgan read the translated report 3 times, her jaw tight with controlled anger. She was 56 years old, a career officer who had risen through the ranks during humanity's expansion into their own solar system. The report wasn't just a military assessment. It was a judgment on humanity's worth, and the Empire had found them wanting. Morgan called an emergency meeting of the Planetary Defense Council, gathering representatives from every major nation and colony. The meeting room was tense and quiet as she presented the facts. An empire spanning hundreds of star systems had looked at humanity and decided they weren't even worth a conversation. They had been weighed and found so insignificant that the aliens couldn't be bothered to threaten them. It was the ultimate insult, and it gave humanity something precious: time. Dr. Richard Cole stood before the council 2 weeks later with a proposal that seemed insane on its surface. He was a physicist who had spent 20 years working on theoretical weapons systems, projects that existed only in computer simulations and academic papers. Now he wanted to build something real, something that would make the galaxy reconsider their assessment of humanity. His plan required resources on a scale never before attempted, pulling scientists and engineers from every nation, diverting funds from civilian projects, and maintaining absolute secrecy. The Cretharians thought humans were primitive, and that assumption would be their advantage. Let the Empire believe they were harmless, Cole argued, while humanity built something that would shatter that belief forever. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. Project Silverline was born in that room, a desperate gamble that humanity's innovative spirit could overcome the Empire's technological superiority. The construction facility was hidden beneath the Martian polar ice cap, carved into the rock by mining drones over the course of 18 months. It was perfect for their needs. Isolated, shielded from casual scans, and far enough from Earth that any catastrophic failure wouldn't endanger the home world. Dr. Cole assembled his team carefully, choosing not just for expertise, but for creativity and the ability to think beyond conventional limitations. Helen Price, a young quantum physicist from California, brought fresh perspectives on faster-than-light travel. Paul Green, a weapons designer who had spent a decade developing planetary defense systems, contributed ideas about concentrated energy projection. Karen White, an engineer specializing in power distribution, solved the seemingly impossible problem of feeding enough energy to weapons that could threaten an empire. Slowly, piece by piece, the prototype began to take shape. The work was grueling and often frustrating. Human technology had to be pushed beyond its theoretical limits, and failures were common in those early years. 3 test reactors melted down before Helen Price cracked the quantum entanglement problem that allowed for instantaneous power transfer. The particle beam prototypes destroyed themselves after a single firing until Paul Green redesigned the containment system from scratch. Materials that should have been impossible to manufacture were created molecule by molecule in zero-gravity fabrication chambers. The probability drive, the revolutionary system that would make their ship untouchable, required 4 years of development and nearly bankrupted the project twice. But humans had something the Cretharians didn't expect: desperation mixed with stubborn determination. Every setback made them work harder. Every failure taught them something new, and slowly, the impossible became possible. Captain Jake Morrison arrived at the Martian facility in 2261, 14 years after that first alien survey. He was 42. A veteran of the colony patrol fleet, with a reputation for unconventional thinking and ice-cold nerves under pressure. Admiral Morgan had personally selected him to command the prototype, looking for someone who could handle both the technical complexity of the new ship and the enormous psychological pressure of potentially starting a war with an empire. Morrison spent 6 months just learning the systems, walking through the partially completed vessel with Dr. Cole, and understanding every innovation, every risk, every potential failure point. The ship was designated UDS Valiant, and she was like nothing humanity had ever attempted. 900 meters of concentrated lethality, wrapped in experimental armor, powered by a reactor that bent physics to the breaking point, armed with weapons that could burn through capital ship hulls in seconds. She was beautiful and terrifying, and she was almost ready. The crew came together slowly, each member handpicked for their skills and their ability to work under extreme stress. First Officer Karen White had helped design the power systems and knew them better than anyone alive. Tactical Officer Paul Green had created the weapons and understood their capabilities and limitations intimately. Navigator Chris Ryan was young but possessed an almost supernatural ability to calculate complex trajectories in his head. Engineer Diane Foster could repair systems in the middle of combat that other engineers couldn't fix in a fully equipped shipyard. 200 men and women, the best humanity could offer, trained endlessly on simulators, while the real ship slowly came online around them. They ran combat scenarios against simulated Cretharian fleets, learning to use the probability drive to appear and disappear like ghosts, to strike and vanish before return fire could touch them. By 2262, 15 years after the Empire had dismissed them, humanity was ready to make the galaxy pay attention. The UDS Valiant emerged from her underground construction bay on a day when Mars hung in perfect alignment with the distant sun. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge for the first time with the ship fully powered, feeling the subtle vibration through the deck plates as the quantum reactor came online. The bridge was smaller than he expected, designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with stations arranged in a semicircle around the command chair. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing ship status, navigation data, and tactical information in crisp blue light. First Officer Karen White was already at her station, running diagnostics on the power distribution network for what must have been the 100th time that week. She was meticulous to the point of obsession, refusing to accept any reading that wasn't perfect. And Morrison was grateful for that attention to detail. One mistake with the systems they were using could vaporize the ship and everyone aboard. The exterior of the Valiant looked nothing like the sleek warships that humanity had imagined in their entertainment media. She was angular and brutal, with sharp edges and flat surfaces designed to deflect sensor scans and scatter targeting lasers. Her hull was composed of layered composite armor, each layer serving a different purpose: heat dissipation, energy absorption, kinetic impact resistance. Beneath that armor lay a lattice of carbon nanotube threading that gave the entire structure incredible tensile strength without adding excessive mass. The ship bristled with sensor arrays and weapon emplacements, every surface optimized for combat efficiency. Dr. Richard Cole had once described her as a floating knife, and Morrison thought that was accurate. There was nothing gentle or welcoming about the Valiant. She was a weapon from bow to stern, and every system had been designed with lethal intent. The Quantum Entanglement Communication Array was the first of the revolutionary systems that set the Valiant apart from conventional warships. Helen Price explained it during one of the crew briefings, using simple terms for those without advanced physics backgrounds. Traditional faster-than-light communication relied on tachyon bursts, which were fast but still had measurable lag over interstellar distances. The entanglement array created paired quantum particles, with one set remaining on the ship and the other distributed to remote relay stations. Any change to one particle instantly affected its paired partner, regardless of distance. In practical terms, this meant the Valiant could coordinate with Earth Defense Command in real time, receiving updates and transmitting tactical data with zero lag. In a combat situation where seconds mattered, that advantage could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The particle beam network was something Tactical Officer Paul Green had been designing since the project began. Traditional energy weapons fired discrete pulses or bolts, which gave enemy shields time to regenerate between impacts. Green's system was different, using a continuous stream of accelerated particles that struck at near light speed. The beams were coherent and focused, burning through shields without giving them time to dissipate the energy. The Valiant mounted 12 primary beam projectors arranged around her hull, allowing her to maintain fire in any direction without having to maneuver. Each projector could operate independently or in synchronized groups, depending on tactical requirements. During test firings against asteroid targets, the beams had cut through solid rock like a blowtorch through paper. Against starship armor, the results were expected to be devastating, assuming the power systems could maintain the necessary energy output. Engineer Diane Foster spent most of her time in the reactor chamber, monitoring the quantum core that powered everything. The reactor was based on principles that most engineers still didn't fully understand. Using quantum probability manipulation to generate energy from the space-time fabric itself. It was clean, incredibly efficient, and produced enough power to run a small city while occupying a space smaller than a cargo container. The downside was instability. The quantum field had to be precisely maintained or it would collapse catastrophically. Foster had developed an almost intuitive sense for the reactor's moods, adjusting the field parameters based on subtle changes in the readouts that other engineers might miss. She slept in a cabin adjacent to the reactor room, claiming she could feel fluctuations in her bones even through the bulkheads. Morrison didn't doubt it, and he was grateful to have someone that dedicated watching over their power supply. The probability drive was the heart of the Valiant's tactical advantage, and it was also the most experimental system on the ship. Navigator Chris Ryan had spent 2 years learning to operate it, starting with computer simulations and eventually graduating to actual test jumps in empty space. The drive didn't move the ship in the conventional sense. Instead, it placed the Valiant in a state of quantum uncertainty across a defined volume of space. For a brief moment, the ship existed simultaneously at multiple possible locations, and when the field collapsed, it could manifest at any of those points. The effect looked like instantaneous teleportation to outside observers, and it made the ship nearly impossible to target. Enemy weapons would acquire a lock on the Valiant's position. But by the time their shots arrived, the ship would already be somewhere else. Ryan described it as surfing probability waves, finding the paths through quantum space that led to optimal tactical positions. It took incredible concentration and split-second timing, but when done correctly, it turned the Valiant into a phantom that could strike from anywhere. The crew trained relentlessly in the months before their first patrol mission. They ran simulation after simulation, facing theoretical Crotherian fleet compositions and learning to exploit the Valiant's unique capabilities. Lieutenant Chris Ryan practiced probability jumps until he could execute them in his sleep, appearing at precise coordinates with minimal calculation time. Paul Green drilled his tactical team on weapons coordination, teaching them to deliver maximum firepower in the brief windows between jumps. Karen White optimized power distribution profiles for every combat scenario they could imagine, ensuring that no system would fail at a critical moment. Diane Foster trained her engineering teams to perform repairs under combat conditions, working in pressure suits while the ship maneuvered violently around them. Morrison watched his crew come together, individual specialists, becoming a unified combat unit that thought and moved as one organism. Dr. Helen Price remained aboard as the senior scientific advisor, her presence a reminder that the Valiant was still as much an experiment as a warship. She monitored every system during the test flights, collecting data and making small adjustments to improve performance. Price had lost sleep over the probability drive's stability, worried that extended combat use might cause quantum field degradation that could trap the ship in a collapsed state. Her concerns were noted, but couldn't change the tactical reality. If the Valiant entered combat, they would push every system to its absolute limit and hope the engineering held. Morrison respected her caution, but knew that sometimes you had to trust in the work and take the leap. Humanity had spent 15 years building this weapon, and soon they would discover if their gamble had paid off. The final systems check took 3 days, with every crew member verifying their stations and running through emergency procedures. Morrison walked the ship during the quiet hours, checking on his people and making sure they were mentally prepared for what might come. Some were excited, eager to finally use the weapon they had helped create. Others were nervous, understanding that their first combat mission might also be their last. He found Karen White in the mess hall at midnight, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked up as he approached, offering a tired smile. They didn't talk about the mission or the danger. Instead, they talked about home, about Earth, and the people they were protecting. When Morrison returned to his cabin that night, he found he could sleep peacefully, knowing that his crew was ready for whatever came next. The Cretharian fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday morning, their arrival detected immediately by Earth's early warning network. Admiral Lisa Morgan watched the tactical display in Earth Defense Command as red icons multiplied across the screen, each one representing a warship that dwarfed anything humanity had built before the Valiant. She counted 12 heavy cruisers, 30 destroyers, and one massive dreadnought that was easily 5 kilometers long. The fleet formation was precise and professional, ships spaced at optimal intervals for mutual defense and coordinated fire. This was not a scouting mission or a casual survey. This was an enforcement action. And the message was clear, even before the official transmission arrived. Battle Admiral Krelmoth composed his ultimatum with the same indifference he had shown to a dozen other primitive species during his long career. The message was translated into human languages and broadcast across every communications channel in the Sol system. Humanity had 30 standard days to evacuate their worlds and relocate to a designated colony zone 300 light-years away. The Cretharian Empire was expanding a trade corridor through this region, and Earth's system lay directly in the planned route. The Empire would provide transport for civilians and essential supplies, demonstrating their generosity and commitment to order. Any resistance would be met with overwhelming force, though the Admiral was confident no such resistance would materialize. Previous experience had shown that primitive species usually understood the futility of opposing imperial directives, and humans would surely prove no different. President Andrew Collins received the ultimatum in the White House Situation Room, surrounded by military advisors and cabinet members. The room erupted in arguments immediately, voices rising as people debated impossible choices. Some advocated for immediate compliance, arguing that resistance against such overwhelming force was suicide. Others demanded negotiation, suggesting that humanity offer something valuable in exchange for being allowed to remain in their home system. A few military officers argued for a fighting retreat, proposing that they could evacuate key personnel and resources while conducting guerrilla strikes against the invasion fleet. Collins listened to them all, his face grave, knowing that every option presented was a form of surrender. He looked across the table at Admiral Morgan, who had remained silent throughout the debate, and asked for her honest assessment. Morgan stood and activated the holographic display, showing the Cretharian fleet positions and projected attack vectors. She explained in clear, precise terms that conventional resistance was impossible. Earth's defense fleet consisted of 40 patrol corvettes and 8 light cruisers, ships designed for piracy suppression and asteroid mining disputes. Against Cretharian capital ships, they would last perhaps 10 minutes before being reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Evacuation was theoretically possible, but would leave behind 90% of Earth's population and all of the Mars and Jupiter colonies. Negotiation was pointless because the Cretharians had already demonstrated that they viewed humanity as insects to be cleared away, not equals to be reasoned with. The room fell silent as her words sank in, and Collins felt the weight of 7 billion lives pressing down on his shoulders. Then Morgan played her final card, activating a secure channel that only 3 people in the room knew existed. The holographic display shifted, showing technical specifications for the UDS Valiant and a personnel file for Captain Jake Morrison. The ship had been kept secret even from most government officials, funded through black budgets and hidden military appropriations. It was humanity's ace in the hole, a weapon built specifically for this moment. Morgan explained the Valiant's capabilities in terms that non-military personnel could understand, describing the probability, drive, and particle beam weapons as force multipliers that might level the playing field. She didn't promise victory, that would have been dishonest, but she offered something more valuable: the possibility of making the Cretharians pay such a high price for Earth that the Empire might reconsider their casual dismissal of humanity. The Planetary Defense Council convened in emergency session 6 hours later, representatives joining via secure quantum links from every major nation and colony. The debate was fierce and often emotional, with accusations of militarism countered by warnings about appeasement. Dr. Richard Cole presented technical data on the Valiant, answering questions about reliability and combat effectiveness as honestly as he could. Helen Price added her assessment of the risks, noting that the probability drive had never been tested in actual combat conditions and might fail catastrophically under sustained use. Paul Green provided tactical analysis, showing computer simulations of the Valiant engaging Cretharian fleet elements. The simulations were encouraging but not definitive, and everyone understood that reality rarely matched predictions. When the vote finally came, it passed by a narrow margin. Humanity would fight. Admiral Morgan transmitted the encrypted order to the Martian facility where the Valiant waited. Captain Jake Morrison received the message in his quarters, reading it 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. His crew had been on standby for 2 weeks, ever since long-range sensors detected the Cretharian fleet approaching from interstellar space. Now the waiting was over, replaced by cold certainty about what came next. Morrison called his senior officers to the conference room and laid out their mission in simple terms. They were to engage the Cretharian fleet and inflict maximum damage, demonstrating to the Empire that Earth could defend itself. Success would be measured not in enemy ships destroyed but in changing the Cretharian assessment of humanity's worth. If they could make the Empire believe that conquest would be too costly, that might buy time for diplomacy or at least prevent immediate extermination. First Officer Karen White asked the question everyone was thinking. What were their chances of survival? Morrison considered lying, offering false hope to keep morale high, but decided his crew deserved honesty. The Valiant was one ship against an entire fleet, experimental technology against proven weapons systems, and 200 crew members against thousands of enemy personnel. By any conventional metric, they were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched. Their only advantages were surprise, superior maneuverability, and the fact that the Cretharians expected no resistance whatsoever. If they could leverage those advantages perfectly, execute every maneuver flawlessly, and experience no critical system failures, they might survive the first engagement. Beyond that, Morrison couldn't make promises. The room was quiet for a long moment before Paul Green broke the silence with a grim laugh, noting that at least they wouldn't die bored. The Valiant launched from the Martian facility 12 hours later, her departure timed to coincide with Mars passing behind the Sun from the Cretharian fleet's perspective. The probability drive engaged the moment they cleared the planet's gravity well, and the ship simply vanished from all conventional sensors. To any observer, the Valiant had ceased to exist. removed from normal space-time and placed into quantum uncertainty. Inside the ship, the crew felt a momentary disorientation as their quantum state became undefined, a sensation that veteran crew members had learned to ignore, but that always left newcomers slightly nauseous. Navigator Chris Ryan plotted a course that would bring them into engagement range of the Critharian fleet from an unexpected vector, using the probability drive to skip across space in ways that conventional faster-than-light travel couldn't match. The trip took 6 hours, during which the crew prepared for combat with methodical efficiency. Engineers checked and rechecked every system, looking for any anomaly that might become critical during battle. Tactical teams ran through targeting sequences, practicing the rapid-fire coordination they would need to make every shot count. Medical personnel set up the small sick bay to handle casualties, knowing that their limited facilities would be overwhelmed quickly if the ship took serious damage. Morrison walked through the ship one final time, stopping to speak with crew members and offer whatever encouragement he could. He found Diane Foster in the reactor room, her hands moving across control panels with practiced ease, and asked if she was ready. Foster looked up with a fierce smile and said the reactor was running at peak efficiency, and she'd keep it that way until the ship broke apart around her or they won. Morrison believed her. The Critharian destroyer squadron was conducting a routine patrol sweep near Jupiter's orbit when their sensors started showing impossible readings. Lieutenant Valkesh, the officer monitoring the sensor station, initially dismissed the anomalies as interference from Jupiter's powerful magnetic field. The readings showed something massive appearing and disappearing across a volume of space approximately 300,000 kilometers wide. But the pattern made no sense. No ship could move that way, appearing in one location and then instantly manifesting somewhere completely different without crossing the intervening space. Valkesh was about to report a sensor malfunction when his entire display went white and the destroyer shuddered violently around him. The UDS Valiant had materialized exactly 300 kilometers from the lead destroyer, close enough that the Critharian ship filled the forward view screen. For a single frozen moment, neither side moved, as if the universe itself needed time to process what was happening. Then Captain Jake Morrison gave the order to fire, his voice calm and precise. Tactical Officer Paul Green's fingers moved across his controls, and 12 particle beam projectors locked onto the destroyer simultaneously. The beams lanced through the vacuum, invisible streams of accelerated particles moving at near-light speed, striking the Critharian shields with concentrated fury. The destroyer's defensive systems reacted automatically, diverting power to the impact points and attempting to dissipate the incoming energy. The shields held for 8 seconds, glowing brighter and brighter as they struggled to bleed off heat. Then, they failed catastrophically, and the particle beams punched through the hull armor like it wasn't there. The destroyer died quickly once the beams reached its reactor core. The containment field collapsed, and the fusion reaction went critical in a massive explosion that lit up the surrounding space like a newborn star. Debris scattered in all directions, some pieces striking nearby ships in the squadron with enough force to trigger damage alarms. Before the shockwave could fully expand, the Valiant was gone again, vanishing into quantum uncertainty and leaving nothing but empty space where she had been. Navigator Chris Ryan had already plotted the next jump, placing them in optimal firing position relative to the second destroyer. The probability drive engaged smoothly, the crew barely feeling the transition as they materialized 400 kilometers from their next target. Paul Green didn't wait for orders. The tactical sequence was already loaded, and he executed it the moment they dropped out of quantum space. Battle Admiral Krell Moth was in his command center aboard the dreadnought Eternal Judgment when the first reports started coming in. The initial message made no sense. A destroyer reporting they were under attack by an unknown vessel that appeared without warning. Before he could request clarification, the destroyer's signal went dead, replaced by the characteristic energy signature of a reactor breach. 3 minutes later, a second destroyer was destroyed in the same manner. Then a third. Krellmoth demanded tactical analysis from his officers, trying to understand what kind of weapon could strike with such precision and speed. His chief tactical officer replayed the brief sensor recordings captured before each destroyer died, showing the same pattern. a medium-sized vessel appearing at close range, firing sustained energy beams that overwhelmed shields through sheer concentrated power, then disappearing before return fire could be directed at it. The Cretharian fleet attempted to form a defensive sphere, overlapping their shields and creating a concentrated field of fire that should have made any attack prohibitively dangerous. It was standard doctrine, proven across centuries of warfare against dozens of different species. Ships moved into position with practiced efficiency, maintaining precise spacing while their weapons charged and their shields synchronized. Krellmoth watched the formation come together on his tactical display, feeling satisfied that the mystery attacker would now face a proper defense. The sphere was designed to eliminate blind spots and create multiple overlapping fields of fire, making it impossible for an enemy to approach without being detected and engaged by multiple ships simultaneously. It should have been impenetrable, and it would have been against any conventional opponent. But the Valiant wasn't conventional. The probability drive allowed navigator Chris Ryan to place the ship anywhere within its operational radius, including inside enemy formations. He calculated the jump with split-second precision, emerging in the exact center of the Cretharian defensive sphere, with all 12 particle beam projectors already charging. Paul Green had programmed a targeting solution that assigned each beam to a different cruiser, spreading their fire to cause maximum disruption rather than concentrating on a single target. The Valiant fired in all directions simultaneously, her particle beams reaching out like the spokes of a deadly wheel. 6 heavy cruisers took critical damage in the first 3 seconds, their shields failing under the sustained bombardment. 2 more cruisers attempted to evade, maneuvering desperately to escape the killing zone, and collided with each other instead. Their hulls tore apart in a cascade of secondary explosions, debris spreading through the formation and causing more collisions as other ships tried to avoid the wreckage. First Officer Karen White called out shield status as the Cretharians finally got organized enough to return fire. The Valiant's shields were sophisticated but not invincible, designed more to deflect targeting sensors than to absorb sustained weapons fire. Energy beams and projectiles converged on their position from dozens of ships, and the shields started failing almost immediately. Morrison ordered an emergency jump, and Ryan executed it before the command was fully out of his mouth. The Valiant vanished just as a plasma torpedo passed through the space she had occupied, the weapon continuing on to strike a Cretharian destroyer that had been behind their position. The destroyer's shields absorbed most of the impact, but the friendly fire caused confusion and forced the fleet to check their targeting solutions to avoid hitting their own ships. Engineer Diane Foster fought to keep the reactor stable as they made jump after jump, each probability transition demanding enormous power. The quantum core was running hot, well above recommended operating parameters, and warning lights decorated her control panel like holiday decorations. She rerouted coolant flow, adjusted the quantum field harmonics, and manually overrode 3 different safety systems that were trying to shut down the reactor to prevent damage. The ship needed power more than it needed safety margins, and Foster was determined to give Morrison every erg the reactor could produce. She keyed the intercom to the bridge and reported they had power reserves for another 40 minutes of intensive combat operations, maybe longer if they could reduce the frequency of probability jumps. Morrison acknowledged the report, and Foster went back to nursing the reactor, making constant, tiny adjustments to keep the quantum field balanced. The battle evolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the Valiant appearing and disappearing seemingly at random, while the Cretharian fleet tried desperately to predict her next position. Paul Green developed a rhythm, timing his weapons' fire to the precise moment they emerged from quantum space, maximizing damage before they had to jump again. Chris Ryan pushed the probability drive harder than it had ever been tested, making jumps at shorter intervals and to more precise coordinates than the designers thought possible. The crew worked together with machine-like efficiency, each person knowing their role and executing it perfectly under pressure that would have broken lesser teams. Morrison watched his tactical display, seeing the number of enemy ships steadily decreasing while the Valiant remained operational despite taking sporadic hits that would have crippled a conventional vessel. Battle Admiral Krellmoth realized with growing horror that he was losing. His fleet had been reduced by 30%, with multiple destroyers destroyed and several heavy cruisers crippled and drifting. The unknown enemy ship seemed impossible to predict or target, appearing anywhere they wanted with no warning. His officers were reporting casualties, damaged systems, and failing morale as crews realized they were facing something they didn't understand and couldn't fight effectively. Krelmoth had fought in a dozen campaigns, put down rebellions and conquered resistant species, but he had never encountered anything like this. The humans, if that's who was attacking, had built a weapon that rendered conventional fleet tactics obsolete. He made the hardest decision of his career and ordered a general retreat, commanding all ships to make emergency jumps to the designated fallback position. Some of his officers protested, arguing that retreat from a single enemy vessel was disgraceful. But Krelmoth overrode them. Better to retreat and report this new threat than to lose the entire fleet to stubborn pride. The Cretharian dreadnought, Eternal Judgment, was attempting to flee toward the edge of the Sol system when Captain Jake Morrison made his final tactical decision. The massive warship was wounded, her shields flickering and unstable after taking concentrated fire from the Valiant during the main engagement. Around her, the surviving ships of the enforcement fleet scattered in disarray, abandoning their formation and making individual jumps to hyperspace. Morrison watched them go on his tactical display, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had broken the Cretharian fleet and sent them running. But the job wasn't finished yet, and he needed to make sure the message humanity was sending would be understood clearly by the Empire. First Officer Karen White reported ship status while Morrison considered his options. The Valiant had taken damage during the engagement. Nothing critical, but enough to show they weren't invincible. 2 particle beam projectors were offline, their focusing crystals cracked by overheating. The shields were running at 60% capacity, several emitters having burned out under sustained fire. The hull had multiple breaches in non-critical sections, and they had lost 6 crew members when a Cretharian plasma bolt penetrated through a weak point in the armor. Engineer Diane Foster reported that the quantum reactor was stable but needed cooldown time. They couldn't sustain maximum combat operations for much longer without risking a cascade failure. Morrison took all this information and weighed it against what they still needed to accomplish. He opened a communications channel to the Eternal Judgment, using the same frequency the Cretharians had used to deliver their ultimatum weeks ago. The transmission took a moment to connect, and then Battle Admiral Krelmoth's face appeared on the view screen. The alien's features were difficult for humans to read, but Morrison thought he saw shock and fury in the rigid lines of his expression. Morrison spoke in clear, measured tones, his words chosen carefully because they would likely be analyzed by Imperial intelligence services for years to come. Humanity had no desire for conquest or expansion into Cretharian space, he explained. They simply wanted to be left alone to develop their civilization in peace. This demonstration had been necessary because the Empire had ignored all attempts at diplomatic contact and instead arrived with weapons and ultimatums. Any future incursion into the Sol system would be met with the same response, and humanity was prepared to defend their home regardless of the cost. Battle Admiral Krelmoth tried to respond with threats about Imperial retribution and the full might of the Empire's war fleets. His words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. The natural authority of someone used to obedience, undermined by the fact that his fleet was retreating in disorder. Morrison let him finish, showing respect for the formalities even though they both knew the power dynamic had shifted. Then Morrison ended the transmission and ordered one final maneuver, something that would serve as both warning and calling card. Navigator Chris Ryan brought the Valiant in close to the dreadnought, so close that the massive ship filled every view screen and external sensor. Tactical Officer Paul Green locked a single particle beam onto the dreadnought's dorsal armor, specifically targeting the elaborate Empire emblem that decorated the hull. The particle beam carved through the armor with surgical precision, burning away the emblem and leaving a glowing scar that would be visible from hundreds of kilometers away. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate message that the Empire's authority meant nothing in human space. The Eternal Judgment's weapons remained silent during this final indignity, her crew either too shocked to respond or having received orders not to provoke further engagement. When the emblem was completely destroyed, Morrison ordered one last probability jump. The Valiant vanished from Cretharian sensors for the final time, leaving the wounded dreadnought to limp toward the system's edge and the relative safety of hyperspace. Inside the Valiant, the crew erupted in cheers and celebration, the tension of combat finally releasing in a wave of relief and triumph. The journey back to Mars was quiet after the initial celebration faded. Morrison walked through the ship, checking on his crew and making sure the wounded were receiving proper medical care. He found Diane Foster in the reactor room, finally allowing herself to rest now that they were no longer in combat. She looked exhausted but proud, having pushed the quantum core beyond all recommended limits and kept it stable through sheer force of will and expertise. He thanked her personally, knowing that without her constant adjustments and emergency repairs, the reactor would have failed and left them dead in space. Foster just shrugged and said it was her job. But Morrison could see how much the acknowledgement meant to her. All across the ship, crew members were processing what they had accomplished, understanding that they had been part of something historic. News of the battle spread across Earth within hours, and across the galaxy within days. The quantum entanglement communication network that connected human colonies carried the tactical recordings and damage assessments, showing in precise detail how one ship had defeated an entire enforcement fleet. President Andrew Collins addressed the United Nations in an emergency session, explaining what had happened and outlining humanity's position going forward. The Sol system would remain independent and neutral, open to peaceful trade and diplomatic contact, but absolutely closed to military incursions. Earth had demonstrated both the capability and the will to defend itself, and any empire that tested that resolve would pay the same price the Cretharians had. The speech was broadcast throughout human space and deliberately leaked to alien communications networks, ensuring that every major civilization would hear humanity's declaration of sovereignty. Admiral Lisa Morgan received reports from intelligence services about the Cretharian Empire's response. The defeat had shocked the Empire's leadership, forcing them to reconsider their assessment of humanity and their expansionist policies. Subject worlds that had lived under Cretharian rule for centuries were suddenly asking questions about the Empire's supposed invincibility. Rival powers were probing Cretharian borders, testing whether the loss at Sol indicated broader weakness. The Empire was dealing with internal challenges that would keep them occupied for years, and their appetite for expansion into human space had vanished completely. Morgan read these reports with satisfaction, understanding that they had bought humanity not just survival, but time to grow stronger and establish themselves as a legitimate power in the galactic community. Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the UDS Valiant returned to Earth 3 days after the battle. Their ship battered, but operational. They entered orbit to find a fleet of ships waiting to escort them down. Civilian vessels alongside military craft, all broadcasting messages of gratitude and celebration. The Valiant landed at the Kennedy Space Center, where thousands of people had gathered despite the short notice. Morrison emerged from the ship to find Admiral Morgan waiting at the base of the ramp, and she saluted him with genuine respect before the crowd erupted in cheers. The crew received medals and commendations, but Morrison knew the real reward was simpler. They had saved humanity's home and earned the right to live free from alien domination. Dr. Richard Cole watched the celebration from his laboratory on Mars, allowing himself a rare smile. Project Silverline had succeeded beyond even his most optimistic projections, proving that human innovation could overcome superior technology when combined with tactical creativity and raw courage. But he knew this was just the beginning. The quantum entanglement networks were already being installed in 10 new ships of the Valiant class, each one incorporating lessons learned from the battle. The probability drive was being refined and improved, made more stable and capable of longer operational periods. Humanity had revealed their secret weapon, which meant they needed to stay ahead of any attempts to copy or counter it. The galaxy had learned that humans were dangerous when threatened, and Cole intended to make sure that lesson stuck. The Planetary Defense Council met to discuss long-term strategy in the wake of their victory. Some members argued for aggressive expansion, suggesting that humanity should claim neighboring systems while the Cretharian Empire was distracted. Others advocated for caution, warning that pushing too hard might unite other civilizations against Earth. Admiral Morgan proposed a middle path. Defensive expansion, focused on securing resources and establishing colonies that could support a growing fleet. They would make no aggressive moves against alien civilizations, but they would also make clear that humanity's sphere of influence was not open to negotiation. The proposal passed with strong support, establishing the framework for humanity's next chapter as a spacefaring civilization that commanded respect through demonstrated capability rather than inherited privilege. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the orbital defense station months later, looking down at Earth and thinking about how far humanity had come. A year ago, they had been insects to be cleared away, beneath the notice of galactic powers who had ruled the stars for millennia. Now they were recognized as a legitimate civilization, dangerous enough to be taken seriously and competent enough to be treated with caution. The price of that recognition had been steep, paid in the lives of crew members who died during the battle and in the years of secret preparation that had strained humanity's resources to the breaking point. But it had been worth it. Because they had earned something precious: the right to determine their own future among the stars. Morrison watched the planet slowly rotating below, cities glowing in the darkness, and knew that whatever challenges came next, humanity would face them on their own terms.